So tonight we're going to be looking at some of the homes that were on the tour in the past. Now, some of the pictures are going to be more current pictures because we didn't have pictures from the past. So let's start off. The Benicia Historical Society presents. We're going to go from 1993 to 2004 of the ones that I found. So for example, we're going to start with 1992. That should have said 92. I was supposed to change it and I didn't. The Timothy Sage house is the first house. Timothy Sage, a brick manufacturer, came to California in 1850 in the midst of the gold rush and struck it rich. He moved to Benicia in 1851, began buying up large tracts of land, and built this home in the fashionable Italianate style. The original structure was brick, with wooden section added on a few years later. Sage married Perlina Booth in 1853, and they had 6 children. Timothy Sage founded the first brickyard in Benicia, one of the first in California. He continued to buy land and construct buildings, most notably the IOOF Hall at 721 First Street in 1861. Rumor has it that he was involved in building the Benicia State Capitol. He was an active member of the Masonic Lodge in Benicia, serving as worshipful master. Sage died in 1890 in an accident on his farm, and Perlina held the house until her death in 1917. Her sister-in-law, Mary L. Booth, inherited the home and ran a boarding house for McKay Tannery employees there during the 1920s. After Mary Booth's death in 1932, the house stood vacant for a decade under the ownership of Helen Booth. With the money scarce during the Depression, the family moved to a smaller house down the street. The family moved, the brick portion was torn down in the early 1930s, and after vandals set fire, twice the family was faced with renovating the house or tearing it down. Helena gave the home to her daughter, Helen Booth, who moved it to the adjacent lot. Helen put in new flooring, plaster, and lighting, and installed arches in the living room. She lived in the house until 1949. Since then, the house has had numerous owners and undergone countless transformations. Gordon Potter bought the house in 1986, and Phil and Robin McMean purchased in 1991. And if the owner of any of these homes is here, let me know, and you can say something about the house that you're in, because there's always stories. There's lots of good stories. The next one is the Framingham Residence, 395 West J Street, built circa 1885 or earlier. This appealing house is characterized by its elegant and Queen-style millwork and gardens. A charming, if not substantial, cottage, the house features an attractive entry and sports a unique frieze banding of vertical dagged boards. Some elements of the building suggest that it may predate 1885, with the Queen Anne detailing being added in the 1890s. Even the 1919 tax assessor was not sure. This was a very common and quite fashionable thing to do in Benicia, and many buildings were treated to new entries and verandas to reflect the owner's success in the 1870s. The 1867 Book of Claims, which legitimized land claims based on the SoCal grant in Benicia, tells us that the land this home sits on was one of the more contentious claims filed. The estate of L. Wright claimed ownership of the property along with 19 other lots in a claim filed May 8, 1867. While his other lots had been encumbered with buildings and a blacksmith shop for some 15 years, this lot had been vacant. The court accepted Wright's claims to all the properties except this one. C.B. Hougton and Edwina Danforth also filed claim to the lot on May 4, 1867, along with some 73 other lots. Their witness, Timothy Sage, swore that he had known the land for 16 years and had owned it from 1862 until 1866, using it for pasturage and raising grain. In 1866, he sold it to the claimants who raised wheat and barley and used the property for grazing. In approximately 1885 and probably earlier, this home was constructed. The owner at the time of the 1919 tax assessor's survey was listed as Jesse F. Frame. Now this is the Amesbury Weinman Foley Hayes Residence, 150 West G Street. The home of Jerry and Mary Ellen Hayes is a classic example of the early, circa 1840s, open gabled cottage that dotted the plains as the American frontier moved west. The Queen Anne detailing was added about 1890, a typical alteration that marked the growing community's success. The interiors have recently been redone in vintage-style Bradbury and Bradbury wallpapers. The open gabled cottage designation refers to the structure's wide gable and plain form. This architectural style was in use for almost 50 years throughout most of the western frontier. It has clean lines and simple form and carries the facade wall straight up into the gable without interruption. The house has a classical orientation in that the facade is a linear temple front in which the roof line and cornice returned form a broken pediment. So that's up in here. This is a garnishing of Greek Revival detail, borrowed from the raging fashionable style of the 1830s and 1840s. The Queen Anne style front porch was added in the 1880s when it is thought that the dormer windows were also built. This wonderful house may have been rented as office space for the state during that period that Benicia served as the state capital from 1853 to 1854. The house was probably built by Horatio N. Amesbury, who was from New England, an early pioneer, civic leader, and developer. Amesbury had business connections with Neville and Hatch, who were involved with shipping and mercantile trade in Benicia during the early 1850s. Other indications are that the house may have been built by Samuel Purdy in 1848 and 1849. Further research is being pursued. The house was later owned by two prominent Benicia families, the Weinmans and the Foleys. The Hayes family can be proud of their excellent restoration of this charming home.
Larry?
Yes.
Jerry, I'm sorry if I missed it, but Jerry told me that at one point he's pretty sure that a very famous teacher lived in the upstairs. Have you heard that from Benicia?
No, I haven't heard that. Oh, Mary Farmer.
She was a young teacher, I guess.
Yeah.
Rented the upstairs. That's what Jerry told me.
Before Jerry owned it, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's see that? We want to know those stories. All right, the next one is the Preisner Residence, 703 Western 3rd Street. That's Francis Preisner. Built circa 1890, just west of the Crooks Mansion, this attractive house shared with its imposing neighbor a commanding view of the Carquinez Straits. In the early 1900s, the original structure was expanded with the addition of the back portion, transplanted intact from another Benicia structure. Over the past century, the house has undergone several interior and exterior remodeling projects. Today, this is 1992, this home derives a portion of its distinctive character from its impressive grounds. The spectacular gardens have been developed by the current owner, who acquired the property some 20 years ago. Its patio is adjacent to an aging wall built by Italian prisoners of war, detained at the Benicia Arsenal during World War II. The Painted Lady Bed and Breakfast, 141 East F Street. Constructed in the late 1890s, this charming Victorian cottage experienced several later changes, including the addition of its central and back sections. Over the years, attempts were made to modernize the building with the removal of most of its exterior decorative trim and the introduction of interior alterations such as false ceilings. In 1985, the house was purchased by its present owner, who set out to recreate the original Victorian flavor. New exterior trim modeled after the original trim was added, high interior ceilings were restored, and the front porch and steps and railings were rebuilt in the style of the 1890s. The house was meticulously painted to further reflect its Victorian heritage, and I don't know what that, Portecochere, reminiscent of those once used to shelter horse-drawn carriages were added, so that would be in the back. Period interior furnishings and decorations were introduced with the goal of recreating the homey atmosphere of, quote, great-grandma's house, unquote. In late 1991, the Painted Lady was opened as a bed and breakfast inn. In addition to hosting visitors from out of town, the inn's guests included local residents who seek a brief respite from the rigors of modern life and a return to the charm of turn-of-the-century Benicia. Now we jump to 1993, Voices of the Past. Built circa 1899, this house was one of two residences constructed next to the original Congregational Church by William F. Schroeder. Schroeder, who occupied the home with his wife, Orphir, O-R-P-H-I-R? Ophir? Also built apartment houses in Stockton and San Francisco. The next owner of the house was Edward Chambers. He served as the Benicia manager of the Solano Electric Light Company in 1904. When Pacific Gas and Electric acquired that company, he became manager of the utilities Benicia office. Local newspapers reported that Chambers was the guiding force for promoting electric vacuum cleaners in town. So there you go, offering demonstrations of the new machines. Frances Perriman, the present owner, and her late husband purchased the house from her brother some 32 years ago. The Perrimans found the home in good condition as her brother had already done considerable reconditioning of the building. They continued the renovation, paying particular attention to the repair of interior ceilings, wallpaper, and exterior repair and painting. Over the years, the Perrimans worked diligently to maintain the historical charm of their home, as attested by the attractive house we are privileged to tour today. Architecture. This attractive Queen Anne cottage has a simple, hipped roof form that visually dominates and unifies its differently shaped components. The front porch carving brackets with drop spindle ornamentation are representative of a very popular theme in Queen Anne architecture. Combined with the canted bay windows with matched brackets and pendant ornamentation, the porch lives up to the exuberance of this architectural style. The next one, the Bowles Residence, 375 West J Street. This house was built around 1885 and served first as the retirement residence for early Benicians, Michael and Catherine Foley. As a young man, Mr. Foley had fled the potato famine in Ireland, immigrated to America, and eventually made Benicia his final destination in 1856. For the next 30 years, he lived and earned his livelihood on his farm about 2 miles west of town. In 1861, he married Catherine Collins, whose two sisters were both residents of Benicia, and the Foleys would ultimately raise 10 children on the farm. In their declining years, they decided to live in town at their newly constructed J Street home, where they would reside until they both died in 1907. For the next 4 decades, the house was occupied by Foley offspring until it was sold to its present owners in 1945. The Bowles initially found the building run down in need of considerable repair. Over the years, they lovingly restored their charming vintage Benicia home. Architecture. Constructed as a hipped cottage, this building is finished out in the colonial revival style. The New England exhibit at the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Exposition sparked a nostalgic interest in colonial architecture. This development is thought to be an expression of America's self-worth. indicative of the nation no longer needing to follow European dictates regarding style. An architectural style indicative of the American Revolution now seemed appropriate to the American people. The homes of the colonial revival style are imitations of the 18th century originals. Some were converted Italianate buildings, stripped of their brackets and reborn. Builders transferred the simplicity of the new designs to the floor plans of established vernacular cottages. The hip roof cottage lent itself well to this process, and the Bowles Residence is local evidence of its success. The next one is the Res Mansion, 285 West G Street. This elaborate stick East Lake style structure has a commanding view of the Carquinez Straits. Built in the 1880s by John E. Crooks, one of Benicia's first bankers. It was soon taken over by his brother, William L. Crooks, a native of Cleveland, Ohio, who came west to seek his fortune. By the 1890s, William was an important member of Benicia's business and political circles. His long and rich local career also entailed a stint as Justice of the Peace and a successful real estate business, which included his construction of Benicia's historic Majestic Theater. By the time of Crook's death in 1950, the mansion had fallen into a state of terrible disrepair, weathered to bare wood by the winds of the Straits, and threatened with demolition. Local Benicians recall that by then the stately old building was known as the town's ghost house. But the structure was eventually saved, and after years of meticulous restoration by its present owners, Antonio and Henrietta Raz, the grandeur of the original house has been reestablished. Architecture. The mansion is a fine example of the stick East Lake style of architecture that flourished in the mid-19th century. Evolving out of the Carpenter Gothic, this style of wood construction is characterized by angularity, verticality, and asymmetry. Roofs are composed of steep, intersecting gables. Verandas and porches are decorated with simple diagonal braces, and gable ends often have reinforcing brackets expressed outside the walls. The residence is distinctive for its spacious, open ground floor plan and large, vertically shaped windows, which afforded its residents an extraordinary view of the Straits and Contra Costa County to the south. The Passalacqua Residence, 159 West G Street. Like its two sisters, Queen Anne's on West G Street, the Passalacqua Residence was built around the turn of the century. For many years, it was owned by John Passalacqua's grandparents, Sylvia and Bill Dank. The present owners acquired the home in 1982. Although they found the building to be in fairly good condition, the Passalacquas still made a number of changes in the process of renovating it. They removed the asbestos shingles, which covered the exterior, and restored the original siding. All of the windows, with the exception of the stained glass window in the dining room, were replaced with wood sash windows. Inside, they replaced several walls and ceilings and refinished the hardwood floors. All of the original lath and plaster remains in the front part of the house: entrance, living room, and dining room. The building continues to evolve as the owners are now constructing a 500 square foot addition in the rear, careful to preserve the architectural integrity of the original house. Architecture. The Passalacqua Residence is a Queen Anne cottage whose gabled bay reflects a more horizontal proportioned facade, as the bay takes up half of the facade, in effect reducing the porch's size. The open gable is treated with notched shingles, with the hallmark brackets and pendant fanals accenting the base. The porch posts reflect a more sinuous, spindled shape with additional bracketing forming a capital at their tops, approaching the combination of delicate forms that gave rise to the popular term gingerbread, which is often used to describe the millwork of the Queen Anne style. The Queen Anne style cottage dominated new construction in Benicia from 1890 through 1910. Many of these cottages were built in pairs or triplets. The Olsen Residence is an example of this practice, having been constructed along with its neighboring homes on either side around the year 1900. However, the true delight of this house is to be found inside. The present owner has employed her considerable talents as a professional artist to create a Victorian style that evokes both contemporary and traditional themes. An old farmhouse table, which she found in the basement and expertly restored, now occupies a large space in her huge country kitchen. Visitors will be inspired by this exquisite decor that abounds in this home. Architecture. The hallmark of the Queen Anne cottage is its dominant protruding gable and its ever-present porch. The gable becomes the focal point for many architectural antics, including decorative novelty cut shingles, intricate barge boards, fancy vents and windows, and a melange of woodwork. The advancement of woodworking machinery found its playground in the Queen Anne style, and the style found its home in the heart of Californians who adopted it with gusto. The Olsen Residence is a cottage that sports fancy cut shingles filling the gable end, with graceful corbel brackets and ball finales marking the bays. An unusual weaved beading elegantly frames both corbel and finale together. The porch posts favor the squared simple columns with beaded base, truncated turned shaft, and squared ad hoc capital all in one. The Fisher Hanlon House, 135 West G Street. The Queen Anne style cottage, wrong one. The Fisher Hanlon House, whose gardens provide the setting for the dessert reception for this year's tour, was built in the early 1850s. It originally functioned as a hotel on Benicia's main business street, but following a series of small fires that partially destroyed the structure, it was purchased by city pioneer Joseph Fisher and moved to its present site next to the state capitol building. A local butcher and quarry owner, Mr. Fisher set about restoring and expanding the building to the rear. He lived in the house until his death in 1884, with Mrs. Fisher surviving until 1891. Despite the changes introduced to the structure by Fisher, it looks today much the same as it did in the mid-1800s when it was a hotel. In 1968, the two surviving granddaughters of Joseph Fisher donated the property and most of its contents to the state of California in memory of their sister and grandparents. In 1975, the state provided the money for the impressive restoration of the building and grounds, and the Fisher Hanlon House was opened to the public on California Admission Day, September 9, 1976. Architecture. The Fisher Hanlon House, simplified version of the classic revival mode, reflects the so-called federal style of circa 1800, which in the West was more Spartan for its lack of decorative detail. Reminiscent of early 18th century East Coast homes, the shuttered windows recall a harsher winter climate. Based on its architecture alone, the Fisher Hanlon House is considered to be a landmark California building. So this is the building we're in right now. It was called the Commanding Officer's Quarters. It was on 1 General Quant Lane. And it's also called the Commandant's. Now it's called Carter's Biz Cafe at 1 Commandant's Lane. The Commandant's Residence is foremost among the surviving buildings of the old Benicia Arsenal. Established in 1850, the Benicia military facility served the nation well through the Civil War, 2 world wars, and numerous other military actions, including the Korean conflict. It functioned primarily as a major West Coast supply depot for the U.S. Army. Acclaimed figures stationed at the arsenal included the likes of Ulysses S. Grant, General William T. Sherman, and Benicia's own General Quant, whose exploits are memorialized in a plaque in front of the Commandant's residence. The architecture. The first known set of plans for this building are updated drawings in the National Archives, which show a 2-story hipped roof, T-shaped structure with a modular cornice. The drawings used for construction of the actual building, located in the National Archives dated March 19, 1859, show a more severe Greek revival structure. In 1876, new plans were drawn and the building was altered considerably on the exterior and interior. An attempt was made to bring the structure more in line with the Italianate style. The building has thick masonry walls over a sandstone foundation in the basement with a plaster exterior finish coat. The structure has 10 fireplaces, not including the brick oven in the kitchen. The fireplaces are coal burning, which accounts for their shallow dimensions, so they're not very deep. Most are marble, some have a simple wood surround. Some of the rooms sport elaborately modeled plaster cornices. The tile border surround in the northeast parlor was added sometime after the 1876 alterations. The Inn at Benicia Bay, 145 East D Street. The house was built in the 1850s on property originally owned by city founder Robert Semple. It changed hands twice during that decade before it was purchased by the Captain John Palladini in 1858. The structure originally stood a few feet west of its present location, but was moved during one of its early alterations. During the disastrous downtown fire of 1867, which destroyed numerous buildings on First Street between D and E Streets, one of the timbers on the roof caught fire but was quickly extinguished. To this day, scars from that fire are on several beams in the attic. This house has continuity unusual in most of Benicia's historic homes. It remained in the same family for more than 120 years. Captain John C. Palladini, his wife Jane, and their young daughter Cecilia occupied the house in the late 1850s. Captain Palladini died in 1862, leaving his widow and orphan daughter to take in boarders. One of these tenants was William W. Dillingham, who eventually married the widow. A daughter, Oceana, was born to the couple, and the Dillingham name was attached to the building until after the turn of the 19th century. Oceana married Charles E. Irwin in the early 1900s, and the house stayed under Irwin ownership until the death of their daughter, Charlene, in 1981. Later, the property was converted into one of Benicia's most popular and distinctive bed and breakfast inns. Present owners Patricia and Michael Lamb have renovated the inn, which now includes 8 suites, an antique shop, and art gallery. But that's incorrect for today's day because they expanded it again. The English-style gardens make it a popular choice for weddings and other special events. The Mazzanese House, 141 East F Street. Is that the same picture? Oh, great. No? 141 East F.
That's the same house.
Yeah, it's the same house.
The different name.
Yeah, so what we do in, every year we put out a bulletin, and so in this case, we already covered this house, but at this time, at 2000, it was the Manzanese house. And so I won't bore you with reading that again, although sometimes they change. And the next one, the Hastings House, 141 West F Street. This 2-story Italianate wood frame house sits on an elevated site west of Main Street. It is rectangular in shape and is structured on a partially raised basement. The roof is low-hipped and complemented in a plain box cornice and frieze. The building is clad with tongue and groove shiplap and has plain end boards. The recessed off-center front door with transom has a small, non-original plain portico reached by wooden stairs with an open railing. A 2-story, 3-sided bay window with 2/2 double-hung wooden sash completes the front facade. There's an additional 2-story bay on the east side. The windows on the rear are all 6/6 and appear to be quite old. The interior is elaborate with wainscot, plaster decorations, period wallpaper, gas lights, and marble fireplaces, of which there are 4. This home was thought to have been built in 1879, with no absolute proof of that date has been found. The builder is unknown, but it is speculated that Daniel N. Hastings owned and occupied the house for some time before 1900. George Hastings was a justice of the peace and for many years the assistant chief of the Benicia Fire Department. He later worked in the ticket auditing department of the Southern Pacific Railroad. The next resident was Mrs. Margaret E. Quinn, a widow who rented out rooms. Among her boarders were Roy Minchin, the telegraph operator, Bernard Devlin, the liveryman, and relatives Simon and May Houlihan, dry goods salespeople. May Houlihan was later the city librarian. The last occupant of that family in the house was Susan C. Gardner, according to the 1954 city phone directory. The present owners and their young family have worked diligently to restore and maintain the character of the house. They recently added a front porch and balcony to the structure. The Bergesen House, 173 West F Street. This beautifully maintained example of a Queen Anne one-story frame house is located near the end of a tree-lined street overlooking the waters of the Carquinez Strait. It is rectangular with medium-pitched gable roof culminating in a box cornice with frieze. The gable pediments are ornamented with fish scale shingles. A small veranda extends to the east of a central front door. To the west is an octagonal bay window with 1/1 panes and a wood frame sash capped by a repeat of the main gable roof. The house sits on a partially raised basement with some 12 wooden steps with open, turned balustrades leading to the porch. The builder of this house is unknown, but the age is estimated to be from 1894. John and Ida Borgensen are the longest inhabitants of the house. John and his wife settled in Benicia in 1882, where he worked as a deckhand on the railroad car Ferry Solano. His wife died in 1912, but John lived until 1941. It is not known for sure if the Borgensens had the house built for them or if it was purchased later. Present owner Kathy Goddard and Ralph Acquire used the lower level as a family room. Kathy is an avid collector who makes Victorian lampshades and porcelain dolls. Her studio overlooks the garden, which she has landscaped herself. Future plans include adding rooms in the attic. There'll be small rooms because those attics are rather small. Is the Fish Riddle House, 245 West K Street. How many people have been in this house? This is a beautiful, beautiful house. Now that also, I can't remember, I was talking with somebody the other day. There's a story about this house. I don't think that person's here tonight. They lived next door back then over on this side. And on that side there's some windows on, both levels. And as, young kids, they swore that they could see people in the windows that weren't the owners and people living there. And so they would never go near the building. And they would always avoid it. They'd go across the street and go around. And even as an adult, she said that she was concerned about going into it, and maybe in 2000, she finally went in, and she couldn't believe that it was such, she was thinking about dungeons and, all this stuff. Torture, yeah. And, but when you walk into the front, there's some stairs to the left, and if you there's a landing that goes up, and then you're going to go this way to go upstairs. And on that landing is, in the floor, is a big fish. And that's where it gets its name, the Fish Riddle House. This home is a good example of a towered Queen Anne style villa, complete with horizontal siding, fish scale, and other patterns of shingle. Built for artist Henrietta Riddle Fish, the interior has elaborate wainscot with copper panels created by Henrietta herself. Former Benicia Mayor George Hussey Riddle was born in 1810 at Nantucket and came to Benicia on December 8, 1849. Henrietta was born in Benicia in 1855 and married Frank A. Fish, a highly respected officer of the Southern Pacific Railroad's riverboat operations. One of the highlights of this home's history was the wedding of Alice Westerberg and Lawrence Fish, only son of Frank and Henrietta Fish, with a newspaper byline of vows plighted beneath beautiful palm trees. The house still retains most of its original configuration and architectural details. The present owners have turned the studio into the dining room and used the original dining room as a family room. The wallpapers were especially designed by Bradbury and Bradbury, Art Wallpapers of Benicia. Take note of the artwork by contemporary California artists Wayne Theinbod, Nathan Olivier, Christopher Brown, and Paul Warner. Enjoy the gardens surrounding the home and cottage. And they're beautiful all the way around. The cottage was built in the 1920s and was most likely used as a caretaker's residence. A young couple lives there now. That was in 2000. Shrikash and Reese Residence, circa 1867 to 1870, is one of several homes on Jefferson Street, formerly Officers Row, built to house Army officers and their families at the Benicia Arsenal. The original four-room house plus attic was a classic Greek Revival structure with the rear addition added around 1893. Hand-forged nails and newspapers found in the walls attest to this period. The house was bought by Tom and Catherine in 1997. They were first intrigued by Benicia after learning that, and here comes the Mills College part. They were first intrigued by Benicia after learning that Mills College in Oakland, where both teach, was originally founded here as Mary Atkins Ladies Seminary. The massive foundation stones under the house have the stonemason's signature chisel marks, visibly etched on the surfaces, and appear to be the same as those on the clock tower stones. The interior walls of the house are lath and plaster, insulated with plugs of newspaper and horsehair. The lovely rippled window panes in the front rooms are original glass. The three dormer windows at the front of the house were added in 1998 by the present owners in keeping with the typical style of mid-Victorian houses around the country. During construction, workers found 19th century newspapers as well as a piece of an old barn door nailed into the eaves, presumably as insulation. The original house had two chimneys and double fireplaces heating the four downstairs rooms. Today, only the fireplace in the living room is original. In the 1950s, the military removed both original chimneys as well as a side window in order to add the current fireplace in the family room. The family has done careful and thoughtful interior renovation over the years, adding period details of built-in bookcases and wainscoting, updating the wiring, replacing torn 1940s linoleum, always taking care to retain the historical integrity of the house. They love their home and are thrilled to be the conservatories of a piece of Benicia's history. And the next one looks very similar, is the Tillis Residence, 1879 Jefferson Street. That's Greg Tillis. Built in 1870, this building was once served as non-commissioned officers' quarters in the Benicia Arsenal. General Quant, whose exploits have been memorialized in a plaque in front of the Commandant's house, was likely born in this house. During its early days, the Tillis Residence was known as Arsenal Building Number 33. In 1990, it was designated as Benicia Historical Place Number 14, and it now serves its current owners very well as a private home. While today is nestled among beautiful shade trees, this framed structure once held a commanding view of Arsenal grounds, Carquinez Strait, and Sassoon Bay. And that's what nature will do for you. Those trees and bushes grow up. Originally, it had two or three fireplaces, since covered over, but foundations remain visible under the house. Recently, two upstairs dormers, modeled after 19th century architectural style, have been constructed to provide more space and light in attic bedrooms. Extensive moldings and Bradbury Victorian wallpapers have been added to most rooms downstairs, and the kitchen, which now features a magnificent original 1939 Magic Chef range, has been thoroughly renovated, and it's still there. They still use it. This handsome two-story wood frame building was originally built by the United States Army in 1868, so it's earlier. The building originally served as family quarters for non-commissioned officers at the Benicia Arsenal. So you see, the one was for the officers, one was for the non-commissioned officer. Now this is a family home. The Chernoff House was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1976 and became a prototype for the City of Benicia's own landmark building program in 1983. You'll see other homes on Jefferson Street that look very much like this, but they're not the historic homes that these three are. Background: the Benicia Arsenal's establishment began in 1847 when Thomas O. Larkin traveled to Washington, D.C. to urge the Secretary of War to purchase the land adjoining the eastern city limits. The first troop occupation took place in 1849, when the U.S. 2nd Infantry arrived under the command of Brevet Lieutenant Colonel Silas Casey with approximately 135 officers and men. By 1859, 7 hand-hewn sandstone buildings had been built: the post hospital, 2 powder magazines, 2 storehouses, the clock tower, and a shop building. During the Civil War, Benicia Arsenal supplied weapons and munitions to troops dispatched to the east, as well as serving its normal duty as the supply and storage arsenal for all troops and posts in the western frontier states. Frisbie Walsh House, 235 East L Street, right across from the post office. This well-known residence is a prime example of a Gothic revival cottage and is considered to be the earliest Gothic revival structure on the West Coast. The building was extensively restored in the late 1980s, having been rescued from a long period of neglect. Architectural style. Gothic revival architecture came to America from England, achieving widespread popularity in a country with an expansive supply of wood. Pattern books by Davis and Downing, noted Gothic revival architects, served to spread the style across the rapidly growing nation. This is one you could pick it out of a catalog, see? The Gothic revival is distinguished by the pointed arch combined with lacy barge boards, bay window, and neo-Gothic tracery. The Frisbie Walsh home is a prime example of the style. As early as perhaps the 1860s, an addition was made to the back of the house. This changes the original T-shaped plan to a cross shape, but has done little to diminish the stylish importance of the building. All of the barge boards, decorations, siding, and windows are original to the house. Background: the house was prefabricated fabricated on the East Coast and shipped around the Horn to Benicia and assembled within 3 months to meet contract requirements. The agreement for its construction was signed between Eleanor Walsh and Theodore Schillebert on behalf of Everett and Company. Eleanor being one of the few extraordinary women listed in the Solano County record book under married women doing business in their own names. It was completed in 1850 and then rented for a period of 2 years to John J. Frisbie and his bride, Fanny, daughter of General Marino Vallejo. After Frisbie left for Vallejo, the Walshes took up residence in the home until they sold it in 1879 to General Thomas McGregor of the U.S. Army. Later owners included Eleanor Bowman, who sold the home to Paul Wetmore, owner of the Benicia Canning Company, in 1931. The Wetmore family resided there until 1976. This is the Lowry Residence, 125 East I. And that is the right picture. And from now on, we have shorter things. History: this residence is one of the handful of bungalows built in the central part of the city during the early 20th century. At one time, this was the home of former Mayor Thomas Wright and his wife Irma, a longtime member and supporter of the Historical Society. Architecture: a very distinctive and stylish bungalow constructed in the central area of Benicia after the standard cottage type became unfashionable. Although of modest design, the unique and inviting front entry and porch beckons the visitor. Interior features include a built-in secretary and china cabinets and extensive wood trim and moldings. This house is one of hundreds of new homes built in Benicia between 1860 and 1900. Although the population growth during this period was not large, the amount of construction is evidence of ample prosperity. This prosperity did not result in the building of lavish dwellings, however, and one of the most striking features about Old Town Benicia is the lack of extremes in its housing. The scarcity of large houses in this district is partly due to the tendency of newly successful businessmen and professional people to move to San Francisco or other large cities. It also seemed that in late 19th century Benicia, living was considered, being ostentatious living was considered bad form. Architecture: this is a one-story Greek Revival cottage with a combination gable-hip roof. The gables include the returns typical of the Greek Revival style, although covered for many years with asbestos siding. This wood frame dwelling has recently undergone both interior and exterior restoration. It was 164 East G Street. Although the exact date of construction is unknown, this cottage reflects the Italianate style of construction prevalent in Benicia in the 1870s and 1880s. This house is a good example of a one-story Italianate design with its symmetry, window treatment, siding, and hipped roof. The detailing, however, particularly in the porch spindles, shows the influence of late 19th century styles that became popular after the Italianate. This structure was prefabricated in Maine and reassembled in its present location in about 1848. The small two-room annex in the rear of the building is believed to have been built here prior to 1848 and contains an original chimney among its other features. Prior to its most recent renovation in 1988, this residence was called the Whatnot Shop and an antique and collectibles store. Architecture. This residence is a clapboard structure and represents a type of early American neoclassicism popular in New England at the time of the 19th century. This residence also represents an archaic use of the federal style in California. The federal style was the preferred architectural mode among the New England aristocrats, a style itself drawn from late 18th century English design. In domestic architecture, a horizontal emphasis predominated with crisp, delicately portioned wall surfaces and clearly delineated windows punctuating the facade. In particular, this Benicia residence most closely resembles the rural, more conservative house designs found in Federalist New England. These tended to be 2 stories with a low-pitched roof, having a more simplified detailing than the more prominent 3-story townhouses of the period. This is a very interesting house inside, too. History. This residence is one of the oldest and most historic homes in Benicia. During most of its history located on a bluff overlooking the east side industrial waterfront, this residence was owned and occupied by the Lewis Decatur Sanborn family, whose roots go back to Boston in 1632, 2 years after the landing of the Mayflower. Lewis Decatur Sanborn, a carpenter by trade, first came to Benicia in 1849 and decided to send back to New Hampshire for the lumber for his home to be cut. Each piece of wood was numbered and shipped around the Horn to him in Benicia. It has long been rumored that Governor Bigler lived in this house in 1853 to 1854, but others have also claimed this distinction. Another story. Architecture. This New England colonial home is a 2.5-story rectangular-shaped structure with a side broken pediment gable roof and a centered front door flanked by double-hung windows and 3 windows on the second story. The entire building is now covered with stucco. However, the front section under the covering is clapboard, possibly pine, and the random width floors and interior walls are pine. The rear, the western 2-story section, is constructed entirely of redwood and is in fact a separate house moved to the site before 1885. History. This early Greek Revival cottage on the border of the old Benicia Arsenal is one of the oldest in this East End neighborhood. The family of longtime Historical Society board member Alex Clark lived in this home from 1900 to 1940, and the current owner, Wayne Cohen, has made many improvements to the house and garden. This is a basic Greek Revival cottage with many of the normal additions made as interior plumbing and other amenities became common. This house still had an acre of land and horses as of 1983. One of the additions was a screened sleeping porch over the front porch pre-1900, which is now completely enclosed. As recent as 1999, this 1-story Greek Revival cottage was located in the center of its original 150 by 125-foot lot, the standard lot size for all residential property in Benicia. When this property was purchased 5 years ago, it was subdivided and this house was moved to its present location. Current owners Liz Giboni and Dennis Meyer have lovingly restored this house both inside and out. The addition of the gables on the east and west sides have created the impression of a much larger house, and the installation of the large decorative windows above the roofline of the front porch has made the front elevation the focal point of the house. It has a strong Greek Revival influence, but with other Victorian area details, makes this residence consistent with a mixture of styles prevalent in this neighborhood. Although we do not have the exact year of construction or the builder of this Queen Anne Victorian cottage, it was most likely built in the last decade of the 19th century, the time frame when most houses of this style were constructed in Benicia. The residential growth of Benicia was mostly to the west up to this time, and well into the 1940s there were few neighboring homes except for a few scattered south or west. 1930s era photos show this home with no sidewalks and no paved streets. Architecture. This residence is an example of the Queen Anne style cottage built in Benicia from 1900 through 1910. The hallmark of the Queen Anne cottage is its dominant protruding gable and its ever-present porch. The gable becomes the focal point for many architectural highlights, including decorative cut shingles, fancy vents and windows, and woodwork. Over the years of previous ownership, this residence lost some of its Victorian character. However, much has been restored and even elaborated upon in an extensive 1999 remodel. On the interior, some original features remain, most notably the pocket doors between the parlor and dining room, the soft pine floors, and the low slope ceiling of what appears to be a lean-to addition to the rear of the house. The country home residence is typical of many east and west side Benicia homes that are a mixture of many styles and design features. There are no records of the exact construction date, but it is most likely pre-1900. The interior appointments in particular hint at an earlier date. This home's rectangular plan, gable roof, and continuous overhung front porch are elements of what is considered as American colonial revival style. Many of the details of this home are typical of the military housing seen in the Benicia Arsenal Historic District and may have been patterned after them. In fact, military outposts in the west and on the frontier were responsible for effecting a great many changes in the local architectural styles. In its earliest years, the location of this home on a hill overlooking most of Benicia's eastern waterfront made it a most attractive locale and residence. History. The gabled roof east side cottage is significant as a residential dwelling for workers at the nearby Pacific Mail Steamship Company, Benicia Agricultural Works, and Yuba Manufacturing Company. The site was owned in 1851 by Harvey Lee, an early Benicia developer. The 1899 Sanborn insurance maps and early tax appraisal records indicate a construction date of 1884. While the overall gable roof, 1.5-story rectangular constructions are common to earlier east side residences, it is clear that this house was embellished with more elaborate Victorian-era details, such as a Queen Anne-style porch in front. A 1940s remodel discarded most of these embellishments. The most recent incarnation of this residence by Joe and Casey Garcia has restored some of those lost details, and future plans include the addition of even more. As with many older buildings in Benicia, this residence reflects a mixture of design style and features that were added and removed over time. Many Victoria-era design elements were used in this house, and yet it is not pure Victorian. Each owner has put a distinctive imprint on the house we see today, and while artist Joe Garcia has shown respect for the historical significance of this east side residential neighborhood, he has put his artistic talents to work to produce a functional yet fascinating interior design. Email the Historical Society, and I'll give you a call and we see if we can't get your home on the tour, because we'll probably start in January, start selecting homes.